The first thing I smelled wasn't the pine of the forest or the wood smoke from the fireplace, but the metallic, sharp scent of bleach coming from the kitchen floor at 3 in the morning. I remember thinking it was strange for a vacation rental to smell like a deep clean chemical spill just as the clock struck midnight, but I dismissed it as the work of a diligent cleaning crew preparing for a New Year's guest. That was my first mistake, and as I sit here typing this with shaking hands while the police lights strobe against my bedroom wall, I realize it was almost my last. I had booked the cabin to escape the suffocating noise of the city, wanting nothing more than a quiet place to start my New Year's resolutions in total isolation. The drive up the mountain was treacherous, with black ice slicking the winding roads and a fog so thick I could barely see 5 feet past my own hood. By the time I finally arrived at the edge of the property, the sun had already dipped below the jagged mountain peaks, leaving the surrounding woods in a suffocating, ink-black darkness that seemed to swallow the dim yellow glow of my headlights. The owner of the cabin, a man named Marcus whom I had only spoken to via an encrypted messaging app, had left the key under a loose stone on the porch. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight like a low, guttural warning that I wasn't smart enough to heed. I spent the first few hours unpacking my bags and trying to ignore the sinking feeling that the floor-to-ceiling windows were like giant, unblinking eyes watching me from the treeline. Why did it feel like the shadows in the corners of the room were shifting every time I turned my back to head into the kitchen? It wasn't until the silent countdown began on my phone that I heard the first real sign of trouble. A soft, rhythmic scratching coming from directly underneath the heavy oak floorboards. It didn't sound like a squirrel or a mountain rat. It sounded like the deliberate movement of a human hand trying to find a grip or a way to pry the wood apart. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, staring down at the heavy rug that covered the cellar door. I knew for a fact that I had slid the brass bolt into the locked position an hour ago, yet now, under the dim amber light of the chandelier, I could see the bolt was pulled back halfway. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the vibrations of the old house had caused the lock to slip, but then the power flickered and died, plunging the entire cabin into a cold, terrifying silence. I stood there in the dark, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps that sounded way too loud in the emptiness of the woods. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a pale shape move across the deck outside the glass doors, a silhouette that was far too tall to be a deer and far too coordinated to be a bear. Someone was circling the cabin, testing the locks, and waiting for the exact moment the new year began to make their move. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained black, the battery drained instantly by the freezing cold that was now seeping through the cracks in the window frames. I reached for the heavy iron fire poker by the hearth, my fingers trembling so violently that the metal clattered against the stone floor with a sound like a gunshot. I retreated into the hallway, trying to remember if I had locked the back door in the mudroom, but a sudden, heavy thud from the roof above my head made me drop to my knees. It sounded like someone had jumped from a high branch onto the shingles, and now I could hear the slow, deliberate crunch of boots moving toward the chimney stack. I realized then that this wasn't a random burglary, because as I looked at the kitchen table, I saw a small, handwritten note that hadn't been there when I checked in. It said, "Happy New Year. I've been waiting for you to get lonely," written in a script that looked eerily like my own handwriting. How could anyone have known I was coming here when I hadn't told a single soul about my travel plans? I felt a surge of cold dread wash over me as the cellar door beneath the rug finally creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan of rusted hinges. A hand reached out from the darkness of the basement. A hand wearing a glove stained with the same bleach I had smelled earlier. I didn't scream. I couldn't, because my throat had completely constricted with pure, unadulterated terror as I realized the owner Marcus had never existed. I had been lured to this remote kill box by someone who had been stalking my social media for months, someone who knew exactly how much I valued my privacy. I backed away into the master bedroom, locking the door and shoving the heavy dresser against the frame, but I knew it was a flimsy barrier against a man who was already inside the house. Outside, the wind began to howl, masking the sound of the intruder moving through the hallway, but I could still feel the vibrations of his footsteps through the floor. He wasn't rushing. He was taking his time, enjoying the hunt, whispering through the door about how no one would hear me scream over the sound of the mountain wind. I looked toward the bedroom window, my only escape, but it was a long 30-foot drop down to a rocky ravine filled with jagged ice and thorns. I had to choose between a potentially fatal fall or facing whatever was currently scratching at the bedroom door with a long, thin blade. The door began to splinter as he kicked it, the wood groaning and cracking under the pressure of his heavy boots. I scrambled to the window, throwing it open and letting the freezing mountain air rush in, stinging my face and numbing my fingers as I climbed onto the narrow ledge. I looked down into the abyss, my head spinning with vertigo, but the sound of the dresser being shoved aside gave me the final push of adrenaline I needed. I didn't jump. I slid down the frozen drain pipe, my palms burning as the metal tore at my skin, until I landed hard in a snowdrift that knocked the wind out of my lungs. I didn't stop to check for broken bones, even though my left ankle was screaming in protest as I scrambled toward the dense line of trees. I could hear him at the window above me, a dark shape silhouetted against the dim interior light he must have turned back on. He didn't yell. He just watched me crawl into the brush, knowing that I had no car keys, no phone, and no way to survive a night in the sub-zero temperatures of the wilderness. I forced myself to keep moving, dragging my injured leg through the deep snow, praying that the moonlight would stay behind the clouds so he couldn't track my footprints. I found a small crevice beneath an outcropping of granite, a space barely large enough for a person to hide, and I wedged myself inside, pulling dead branches over the opening. I watched through the gaps in the wood as his flashlight beam began to sweep across the forest floor, a predatory eye searching for any sign of my path. He was so close I could hear the crunch of his boots on the frozen crust of the snow, and I had to bite my own hand to keep my teeth from chattering loud enough to give me away. He stood just 3 feet from my hiding spot for what felt like an eternity, the beam of his light passing inches over my head. He began to talk to himself, a low, conversational mutter about how he had spent weeks preparing the cellar for my arrival and how disappointed he was that I had ruined the surprise. The banality of his voice was more terrifying than any scream would have been, because he sounded like a man discussing a ruined dinner rather than a botched murder. Eventually, the light began to fade as he moved further into the woods, convinced I must have tried to make a run for the main road. I waited in that frozen hole for hours, my toes going numb and my vision blurring from the onset of hypothermia, until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the trees. I knew I couldn't stay there, so I used the rising sun to orient myself and began the grueling trek back toward the distant highway. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every shadow looked like a man with a knife, but I pushed through the pain until I saw the asphalt clearing. I flagged down a passing snowplow, the driver looking at me like I was a ghost as I collapsed into the warm cab, sobbing with a mixture of relief and pure, cold horror. When the police finally searched the cabin, they found the cellar filled with enough supplies to keep someone prisoner for years, along with a collection of photos of me taken through my own apartment windows back in the city. They never found Marcus, and they never found the man in the woods, but I haven't spent a single night alone since that New Year's Eve. I moved to a different state, changed my name, and I never, ever book a vacation rental that doesn't have a 5-star rating and a verified identity. But sometimes, when the wind howls at night and the floorboards in my new apartment creak, I still smell that faint, sharp scent of bleach. The fluorescent lights of the 14th floor hummed with a low, buzzing vibration that seemed to vibrate inside my skull as I sat at my desk, the only person left in the massive glass tower. It was New Year's Eve, and while the rest of the city was gathered in the streets below, clutching champagne bottles and wearing glittery hats, I was stuck finishing a security audit that my boss insisted had to be on his desk by morning. The silence of the office wasn't the peaceful kind. It was a heavy, artificial quiet that made the sound of the air conditioning vents feel like someone whispering just behind my ear. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the distant fireworks exploding over the harbor, feeling a strange sense of vertigo as if the building were swaying in the wind. I checked the time on my computer monitor, which read 11:45, and I promised myself I would leave the moment I hit the save button on the final spreadsheet. I reached for my cold coffee, but as I lifted the mug, I heard a sound that didn't belong in a locked office building. The distant, rhythmic ding of the elevator reaching our floor. I froze, my hand hovering in midair, because I knew for a fact that the lobby security guard had logged me out as the last remaining tenant an hour ago. The doors of the elevator hissed open at the far end of the darkened lobby, followed by the slow, heavy thud of work boots stepping onto the carpet. I lowered my head, hiding behind the glow of my dual monitors, hoping it was just a janitor I hadn't noticed earlier. But the footsteps weren't moving toward the trash bins or the break room. They were moving with a slow, predatory intent, stopping at every cubicle as if the person were looking for someone specific. I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck when I realized the footsteps were getting closer to the row of desks where I was sitting. I slowly peered through the gap between my monitors and saw a tall man dressed in a tattered maintenance uniform, carrying a heavy pipe wrench in one hand and a set of master keys in the other. He didn't look like he was there to fix a leak. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and he was muttering a string of names under his breath, names of the executives who had handled the recent round of layoffs. I realized with a jolt of terror that this was Arthur, an employee who had been fired 2 weeks ago for threatening a manager, and he had clearly found a way to bypass the new security codes. I ducked under my desk just as his flashlight beam swept across my workspace, the circle of light dancing over my keyboard and the framed photo of my family. I held my breath until my lungs burned, praying that he wouldn't notice my computer was still humming or that the power brick under the desk was glowing blue. He stayed there for what felt like hours, his heavy breathing the only sound in the room, before he finally moved on toward the executive suites at the end of the hall. I knew I had to get to the fire exit, but the only way out was to cross 30 feet of open floor plan where I would be perfectly visible if he turned around. I crawled on my hands and knees, the coarse carpet burning my skin, moving inch by inch toward the heavy steel door of the stairwell. Just as my hand reached for the handle, my phone began to vibrate in my pocket with a loud, buzzing New Year's greeting from my mother. The footsteps stopped instantly, and then I heard the sound of the man sprinting across the office toward my location, the heavy wrench clanking against the metal desks as he ran. I didn't think. I threw myself into the stairwell and slammed the door shut, shoving the emergency bar down and hearing the lock click just as he threw his weight against the other side. The door shuddered under the force of his impact, and I could hear him screaming through the steel, his voice distorted and full of a jagged, mindless rage. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and began to fly down the concrete stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I reached the 12th floor and tried the door, but it was locked from the outside for security, meaning I was trapped in the concrete throat of the building with no way out except the ground floor. As I rounded the landing of the 10th floor, the lights in the stairwell flickered and then died completely, leaving me in a darkness so absolute I couldn't even see my own hands. I heard the door at the top of the stairs, the 14th floor door, groan as if it were being pried open with a crowbar. He had a tool and he was coming down after me, and in the pitch-black silence, every footstep I took sounded like a drumbeat telling him exactly where I was. I took off my shoes, holding them in my left hand so I could move silently, and began to descend the stairs as fast as I dared in the dark. I could hear him above me, not running anymore, but walking slowly, letting the wrench scrape against the metal handrail with a terrifying clink sound. He was playing with me, knowing that he had the only light and that I was heading toward a lobby that was likely locked from the inside. I reached the 5th floor and paused, my back pressed against the cold concrete wall, trying to control my ragged breathing so he wouldn't hear me. Suddenly, the stairwell was flooded with light from a flashlight beam coming from below me, and for a second, my heart leaped with hope that it was the security guard. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice cracking with desperation. But there was no answer, only the sound of the flashlight being set down on a step. I realized then that he had dropped his light through the gap in the center of the stairs to trick me into thinking someone was waiting for me. It was a psychological trap to make me freeze, and it worked because in that moment of hesitation, I heard the heavy thud of his boots landing on the floor directly above mine. I bolted down the remaining flights, my bare feet hitting the cold concrete with a slapping sound that echoed through the entire shaft. I reached the ground floor lobby and threw myself at the glass doors, but they were reinforced and required a keycard that was still sitting on my desk 14 floors up. I looked around the darkened lobby, seeing the security desk abandoned, the monitor screens showing a loop of empty hallways. The guard was nowhere to be found, and as I looked toward the elevator bank, I saw the indicator lights moving. Someone was coming down, and another person was already in the stairwell behind me. I dived behind the large marble reception desk, curling into a ball as the stairwell door burst open and Arthur stepped out, his face contorted in a mask of sweat and fury. At the same time, the elevator doors opened, and for a terrifying second, I thought there were two of them, but it was just the empty car. Arthur didn't see me at first. He began to smash the glass of the display cases in the lobby, screaming about how the company had stolen his life and now he was going to take theirs. I saw a heavy brass letter opener on the desk and gripped it, my knuckles white, preparing myself for a fight I knew I couldn't win. He began to walk toward the reception desk, his boots crunching on the shattered glass, the wrench raised high over his shoulder as he laughed a low, broken sound. "I know you're here. I saw your car in the lot," he crooned, his voice echoing off the high marble ceilings of the lobby. Just as he reached the edge of the desk, the building's automated New Year's system triggered, and suddenly the lobby was filled with the deafening sound of a pre-recorded countdown and the high-pitched blast of air horns. The sudden noise startled him, making him spin around toward the speakers, and I used that 1 second of distraction to spring from my hiding spot. I didn't try to fight him. I ran for the security desk's emergency panic button, the one that triggered the external sirens and the automatic police dispatch. I slammed my fist onto the red button, and a second later, the entire building began to wail with a piercing alarm that was even louder than the New Year's music. Blue and red strobe lights began to flash outside the glass doors, reflecting off the snow on the sidewalk, and I saw a police cruiser rounding the corner just a block away. Arthur realized his time was up and lunged at me, the wrench whistling through the air and narrowly missing my temple as I dove over the counter. I scrambled toward the small mailroom behind the desk and slammed the heavy oak door, sliding the deadbolt just as he began to hammer on the wood. I huddled in the corner among the packages and envelopes, listening to the sirens get closer and closer until the sound of tires screeching on the pavement signaled the arrival of help. I heard the front glass of the lobby shatter as the police forced their way in, followed by the muffled shouts of orders and the sound of a heavy struggle. After what felt like an eternity, a calm, authoritative voice called out my name, telling me that it was safe to come out. I opened the door to find Arthur pinned to the floor in handcuffs, his face pressed against the marble he had tried to stain with blood. The security guard was found tied up in the basement, shaken but alive, and as the paramedics wrapped a blanket around my shivering shoulders, the clock finally struck midnight. People in the street were cheering and hugging, oblivious to the nightmare that had just unfolded 30 feet away from them. I looked up at the 14th floor, where my office light was still burning, and I knew that I would never set foot in that building again. The new year had started with a scream, and though I was safe, I knew that the silence of an empty office would never feel peaceful to me ever again. The invitation was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold leaf edges that shimmered under the streetlights of Park Avenue. I remember thinking that tonight was going to be the pinnacle of my social life, an exclusive New Year's Eve gala at the Miller Penthouse, 40 floors above the city's noise. I didn't belong there, of course. I was just a last-minute plus one for a girl I had met only a week prior, but I dressed in my best tuxedo and tried to look like I owned a tech company or a hedge fund. Looking back, I realized that my desire to blend in with the elite was the only thing that kept me alive when the party turned into a hunting ground. The penthouse was a masterpiece of glass and steel, filled with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, bubbly aroma of vintage champagne. Everyone was laughing, their diamonds catching the light of the massive chandeliers. And for the first few hours, it felt like a dream where the world's problems didn't exist. But as the clock neared 11, I noticed something off about the catering staff who were circulating with silver trays. They weren't making eye contact with the guests, and their movements were too precise, too coordinated, like soldiers in a theater play. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running behind his ear, caught me staring and gave me a look so cold it made the ice in my glass feel warm. I decided to find a quiet place to clear my head, slipping away from the main ballroom and wandering down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with rare artwork. I found a small study at the end of the hall, but just as I was about to enter, I heard the sound of a heavy suppressed thud followed by the shattering of glass coming from the master suite. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs, and peered through the crack in the door. Two of the servers were standing over the host, Mr. Miller, who was slumped in his chair while they rapidly began to spray paint the security cameras with black lacquer. They weren't there for the party. They were professional thieves, and they weren't planning on leaving any witnesses to their New Year's heist. I heard a faint metallic click as they drew silenced pistols from beneath their white serving jackets, and I realized with a jolt of pure electricity that the party was now a trap. I backed away, my shoes squeaking on the polished marble, a sound that felt like a siren in the sudden, heavy silence of the hallway. "Did you hear that?" one of the men whispered, his voice like gravel grinding together, and I didn't wait to hear the answer. I turned and bolted, but I couldn't go back to the ballroom because I could already hear the heavy doors being chained shut from the outside. They were sealing the guests in, and I was the only one left in the safe zone of the back wings. I ducked into a small utility closet where the cleaning supplies were kept, pulling the door shut just as the man with the scar stepped into the hallway. I held my breath, the scent of lemon ammonia burning my nostrils, as I watched his shadow pass through the sliver of light at the bottom of the door. He was moving slowly, his boots making a soft thud-thud sound that seemed to sync up with my own panicked heartbeat. I looked around the tiny closet, searching for anything I could use as a weapon, but all I found was a heavy brass floor polisher and a spray bottle of industrial degreaser. I knew I couldn't outfight professional mercenaries, so I had to outthink them in a penthouse that was essentially a glass cage. I noticed a small crawl space near the ceiling, a vent used for the building's complex climate control system, and I began to climb the metal shelving with desperate, trembling hands. The metal groaned under my weight, and I froze, terrified that the sound would bring the man with the scar back to my door. I managed to shimmy into the duct just as the closet door was kicked open with a violent force that sent the cleaning bottles tumbling to the floor. I lay flat on my stomach, the cold tin of the vent pressing against my chest, watching through the slats as the gunman entered the room. He poked his silenced barrel into the coats and mops, his movements calculated and cold, before he cursed under his breath and stepped back out. I knew I couldn't stay in the vent forever. The air was thin, and the thieves were likely going to start a room-by-room sweep to ensure no one had slipped away like I did. I crawled through the ductwork, the sound of my movement echoing like a drum inside the metal tube, until I reached a vent that overlooked the main ballroom. Below me, 100 people were huddled on the floor, their hands over their heads, while the caterers moved among them, systematically stripping them of their jewelry and watches. It was a high-stakes robbery masked by the noise of the city's celebration, and as I watched, the lead thief checked his watch. It was 11:50. They were planning to be gone by the time the fireworks started, using the explosions as cover for their escape down the service elevator. I realized I had to do something to alert the police, but the thieves had already jammed the cell signals in the penthouse. I looked toward the far end of the ballroom and saw the main fire alarm pull station, but it was guarded by a man with a submachine gun who looked like he was itching for a reason to use it. My only hope was the penthouse's external terrace, a narrow ledge of stone that wrapped around the building 40 stories up. If I could get out there, I could signal the police helicopters that were already circling the city for the New Year's parade. I backtracked through the vents, my skin slick with sweat and dust, until I found a release lever for the kitchen's exhaust system. I dropped down into the pantry, the smell of expensive hors d'oeuvres now sickeningly sweet in the stagnant air, and crawled toward the service door. I could hear the thieves talking in the kitchen, discussing how they were going to dispose of the excess baggage once the safe was emptied. They weren't just going to rob these people. They were going to eliminate the evidence. I reached the terrace door and slipped outside into the biting, freezing wind of the New Year's night. The city was a sea of lights below me, completely unaware of the life and death struggle happening in the clouds. I began to climb the decorative stonework toward the roof, my fingers numbing instantly as the wind tried to rip me off the side of the building. I reached the top of the parapet and saw a large, high-intensity spotlight used for holiday displays, and I began to kick the glass, hoping to create a strobe effect that would catch the eye of a pilot. Suddenly, the door to the roof burst open, and the man with the scar stepped out, his face twisted in a snarl of frustration. "You're a persistent little rat, aren't you?" he shouted over the wind, raising his pistol and taking aim at my chest. I didn't have anywhere to run, but I noticed the heavy power cable for the holiday lights snaking across the floor near a pool of melting snow. As he stepped forward to fire, I grabbed a metal pole and swung it with everything I had, striking the cable and sending a shower of white-hot sparks directly into his face. He screamed, blinded by the flash, and his shot went wide, shattering the glass of the spotlight behind me. The sudden explosion of light and sound finally caught the attention of a police helicopter that had been hovering a few blocks away. The searchlight of the chopper swung around, bathing the roof in a blinding white glare that pinned the thief like an insect against the stone. He tried to fire at the helicopter, but the snipers on board were faster, and a single crack of a rifle echoed through the night, dropping him to the ground. I collapsed against the ledge, my legs turning to jelly, as the roof was suddenly swarmed by tactical teams rappelling from the sky. They moved with a speed that made the thieves look like amateurs, and within minutes, the penthouse was secure and the guests were being let out, shaken but alive. As I sat on the edge of the roof, wrapped in a heavy tactical blanket, the first of the New Year's fireworks began to explode at eye level. Red, green, and gold bursts filled the sky, and for the first time that night, the noise was beautiful because it meant the nightmare was finally over. I looked down at my hands, which were still stained with the dust of the vents and the grease of the kitchen, and I realized that I didn't care about the cream-colored cardstock or the gold leaf invitations anymore. I had survived the most exclusive party in the world, and all I wanted for the new year was a quiet room with a door that actually locked from the inside. The Miller penthouse would be a crime scene for months, but as I was escorted to the elevator, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had seen the worst of humanity 40 stories up, and I had come back down to earth alive. The celebration at the downtown lounge had been a blur of loud music and expensive drinks, but by 2 in the morning, the freezing New Year's air had snapped me back into a sharp, uncomfortable sobriety. My phone battery was hovering at a precarious 3%, and the street was a chaotic mess of people trying to flag down cabs that weren't coming. When the black sedan pulled up to the curb and the driver called out my name, I felt a wave of pure relief wash over me. I didn't even check the license plate. I just pulled open the heavy rear door and slid into the warmth of the leather interior, grateful to be out of the biting wind. "Long night?" the driver asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the back of my seat. He was wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and the rearview mirror was angled in a way that I could only see the bottom half of his face. I nodded, leaning my head back against the headrest and watching the neon lights of the city blur past the window. "Just want to get home?" I murmured, my eyes drifting shut for a second as the heater blasted hot, dry air onto my frozen ankles. It took me about 5 minutes to realize that we weren't heading toward the expressway that led to my apartment. "Hey, I think you missed the turn back there," I said, sitting up straighter and looking out at the unfamiliar warehouses of the industrial district. The driver didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. His hands remained perfectly still at the 10-2 position on the steering wheel. I reached for the door handle, thinking I would just get out at the next stoplight, but the handle moved freely in my hand with a sickening, hollow click. I pulled harder, but the door remained firmly shut. and I realized with a jolt of ice-cold dread that the child's safety locks had been engaged. "Open the door," I said, my voice rising in pitch as I felt the first surge of genuine panic clawing at my throat. I reached over to the driver's side to grab the lock switch, but a thick plexiglass partition, one I hadn't noticed when I climbed in, blocked my path. This wasn't a standard rideshare vehicle. It was a cage on wheels, designed to keep someone in without any hope of escape. The driver finally looked up into the mirror, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I saw the corners of his mouth curl into a slow, jagged yellow grin. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling so violently that I almost dropped it between the seats, but the screen remained black. The battery had finally died, leaving me completely cut off from the outside world in a moving prison that was accelerating away from the safety of the city lights. I began to kick at the window, my heels slamming against the glass with a dull thud. But the windows were reinforced, likely polycarbonate instead of standard glass. "Nobody is looking for you tonight," the driver finally spoke, his voice devoid of any emotion as he turned onto a dirt road lined with skeletal, leafless trees. "Everyone is too busy celebrating to notice one person missing from a crowd of millions." The road became bumpier, the car swaying as we headed deeper into the marshlands that bordered the edge of the county. I looked around the back seat, searching for anything I could use to defend myself, and my hand brushed against a metal object tucked into the seat pocket. It was a heavy, industrial-sized screwdriver, likely left there by the driver when he was installing the partition. I gripped the handle, the cold metal feeling like a lifeline in the darkness, and I began to look for a weakness in the plexiglass barrier. I noticed that the partition wasn't welded. It was held in place by heavy-duty bolts that were exposed on my side of the cabin. If I could loosen the bottom bracket, I might be able to kick the bottom of the screen forward and get to the driver or the steering wheel. I leaned down, masking my movements by pretending to sob into my hands, and began to work the tip of the screwdriver into the first bolt. The screech of metal against metal was hidden by the loud, distorted heavy metal music the driver had just turned up to drown out my screams. Every time the car hit a pothole, the screwdriver slipped, tearing the skin on my knuckles, but the adrenaline kept the pain at bay. I worked with a frantic, desperate energy, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I watched the GPS glow on the dashboard. We were miles from the nearest house now. I got the first bolt loose, then the second, and I felt the partition give way just a fraction of an inch. I knew I only had one shot at this. If he realized what I was doing, he would stop the car and finish it right there on the side of the road. The driver slowed down as we approached a rusted-out bridge that spanned a black, sluggish river. He began to pull over onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching under the tires like breaking bones. I waited until the car came to a complete stop and I heard him unbuckle his seatbelt, the metallic clack signaling the start of his final move. As he turned in his seat to face me, I didn't wait for him to open the partition or the door. I threw my entire body weight against the weakened bottom of the plexiglass. The bracket snapped with a loud, sharp crack, and the bottom of the shield swung forward, pinning his arm against the steering wheel. He let out a roar of pain and surprise, reaching for a hunting knife tucked into the center console, but I was faster. I lunged through the gap, driving the heavy screwdriver into his shoulder with every ounce of strength I had left. He screamed, dropping the knife, and I used the moment to reach over his lap and pull the master unlock switch on the driver's door. The locks hissed open, and I tumbled out of the back seat and onto the wet, frozen mud of the riverbank. I didn't look back. I scrambled down the embankment, the tall, dead grass whipping against my face as I ran toward the dark water. I could hear him behind me, swearing and stumbling as he tried to pull the screwdriver out of his flesh. I found a hollowed-out log near the water's edge and crawled inside, my heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it from the road. I watched through a knothole in the wood as his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, the light dancing across the surface of the river just feet away from my hiding spot. He was limping, his dark coat stained with a spreading patch of black blood, and he looked less like a man and more like a wounded animal hunting for its last meal. "I'll find you," he bellowed into the night, but the wind was picking up, carrying his voice away into the empty marshes. He circled the area for 20 minutes, his boots squelching in the mud, before the sound of a distant siren made him freeze. The driver of the snowplow I had seen earlier must have reported the erratic driving, or perhaps someone had seen the black sedan lure me in. Whatever the reason, the sight of far-off blue lights caused the driver to panic. He scrambled back up to the road, the car tires spinning and throwing mud into the air as he sped away into the darkness. I stayed in that log for another hour, my body shivering so hard I thought I would go into shock, until the sun began to peek over the horizon. I eventually made it to a small gas station 3 miles down the road, where the terrified clerk called the police. They found the black sedan abandoned in a junkyard 2 days later, the interior scrubbed with bleach, but the screwdriver was still there, coated in his DNA. They never caught the man, but they found out the car was a ghost vehicle with stolen plates and a forged VIN. I don't use rideshare apps anymore, and I never get into a car unless I can see the driver's face and verify that the child locks are off. Every new year, I think about that bridge and the man with the yellow grin, and I realize that the most dangerous part of a night out isn't the party, it's the ride home.